He's stealing company secrets. Richard Coleman's voice cracked across the executive boardroom like a fire alarm, so sharp and sudden that every conversation stopped at once. Heads turned. Laptop screens froze mid-presentation. Coffee cups hovered halfway to waiting lips. Even the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed to disappear beneath the weight of those 4 words. At the center of the room stood Marcus Bennett, a tall black man in a faded gray maintenance jacket with a small toolbox resting beside his boots. One hand remained calmly on the edge of a sleek glass display cabinet, while the other held a small electronic device no larger than a television remote. Around him, expensive Italian suits shifted uneasily. The boardroom overlooked downtown Charlotte through 30-foot windows glowing with the pale light of an early Tuesday morning. Yet inside the room, everything suddenly felt colder. "Don't let him move," Richard ordered, pointing directly at Marcus without taking his eyes off him. 2 security officers stepped forward from opposite sides of the conference room, their polished shoes clicking across the marble floor with measured confidence. Marcus did not step backward. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked from one face to another as though searching for someone willing to ask a single question before reaching a conclusion. No one did. Several executives exchanged nervous glances. One quietly slid a smartphone beneath the conference table, already recording what promised to become the biggest corporate scandal of the year. Someone whispered that the stranger had been wandering through the building since sunrise. Another insisted he had been seen near the executive elevators. A woman near the far end of the table leaned toward her colleague and muttered that she knew something like this would eventually happen after the company relaxed visitor policies. Marcus heard every word. His expression never changed. Richard Coleman straightened the cuffs of his navy suit before taking another deliberate step toward him. Years of leading one of the largest cybersecurity companies in America had taught him to trust instinct above hesitation. His investors expected certainty. His employees admired confidence. Doubt, in his world, was expensive. The strange device in Marcus's hand looked unfamiliar, and unfamiliar meant dangerous. "Who sent you?" Richard demanded. Silence answered him. Not because Marcus was afraid, but because he seemed almost surprised by the question itself. His eyes drifted briefly toward the massive digital screen displaying confidential merger documents before returning to the CEO. Outside, sunlight reflected off neighboring skyscrapers, filling the room with bright ribbons of gold that contrasted sharply against the tension settling over every chair. Marcus slowly lowered his toolbox onto the polished floor. The metallic latch clicked softly, impossibly quiet against the pounding heartbeat everyone suddenly seemed to share. "Sir," he finally said, his voice steady enough to unsettle the room even more. "Before anyone makes a mistake they'll regret, I'd appreciate exactly 60 seconds. Richard's jaw tightened. "You don't get to negotiate." One security officer reached toward Marcus's wrist, ready to escort him away. Marcus neither resisted nor retreated. Instead, he looked directly at the CEO with calm, unwavering eyes that carried neither anger nor fear, only certainty. Then, almost gently, he spoke a sentence that made several people around the table glance toward Richard in confusion. "Mr. Coleman," Marcus said, "are you absolutely certain I'm the person your board expected to stop this meeting today?" The conference room remained motionless. The security officer hesitated, his hand stopping just inches from Marcus Bennett's sleeve. It was not fear that slowed him. It was uncertainty. Marcus had spoken with the calm confidence of someone who expected to be questioned, not someone trying to escape it. Richard Coleman narrowed his eyes, refusing to let the silence shift the balance of authority. Around the long walnut table, executives studied the stranger more carefully than before. His maintenance jacket was clean despite its faded color. His work boots carried dust from the parking garage instead of mud from a construction site. Even the worn toolbox at his feet showed careful organization, every latch polished from years of use rather than neglect. Marcus slowly folded his hands in front of him. His breathing never changed. Long before this morning, he had learned that panic only invited more assumptions. His father had taught him that lesson decades earlier while repairing elevators across North Carolina. "People will decide who you are before they ask your name," he used to say. "Your job is not to become louder. Your job is to remain truthful long enough for the truth to arrive." Marcus had carried those words through every chapter of his life. After serving 8 years in the United States Army, he earned certifications in network security and critical infrastructure protection. He spent nearly a decade protecting hospitals, airports, and financial institutions from invisible threats that could cripple entire cities. Yet after leaving government work to care for his mother during her final illness, his impressive resume developed a gap that recruiters noticed before his experience. Interviews became shorter. Opportunities quietly disappeared. Eventually, consulting jobs replaced executive offices. Temporary contracts replaced permanent titles. None of it changed how seriously Marcus approached his work. 3 weeks earlier, an unexpected phone call had interrupted a quiet Saturday morning while he repaired an old ceiling fan in his Charlotte home. The caller identified herself only as a representative acting on behalf of a corporate board seeking an independent security assessment. Complete confidentiality was essential. Even the company's chief executive would not be informed until the evaluation concluded. Marcus accepted because the assignment matched exactly what he had spent years doing. Observe quietly. Verify facts. Report honestly. Early that morning, he entered Coleman Technologies through the service entrance carrying the same toolbox now resting beside him. No expensive briefcase. No tailored suit. Just equipment chosen for function rather than appearance. During the previous 2 hours, he inspected access points, scanned wireless signals, reviewed physical security controls, and quietly documented weaknesses that most employees never noticed. Then one discovery changed everything. A secure presentation file prepared for the billion-dollar merger had been replaced overnight by an altered version carrying hidden authorization code. Someone inside the company had modified confidential material without triggering standard alerts. Marcus traced the activity to the executive floor moments before the board meeting began. He had arrived only to prevent the presentation from continuing. Instead, he found himself standing before a room filled with people who had already decided exactly who he must be. Still, he refused to let frustration replace patience. The truth, he believed, did not become stronger because someone shouted louder. It simply waited for the right moment to be seen. Richard Coleman let out a slow breath, but the tension never left his shoulders. The polished walnut table, the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the skyline that usually reminded him of everything he had built suddenly felt like scenery behind a courtroom. Every executive in the room waited for him to make the next decision because that was what leaders at Coleman Technologies always did. Richard had earned his reputation by acting quickly. 20 years earlier, he had founded the company inside a rented office no larger than 400 square feet, with 2 folding desks and 1 aging desktop computer. Since then, every major success had come from trusting his instincts before anyone else believed him. Investors praised his decisiveness. Financial magazines celebrated his discipline. Employees admired the certainty that seemed to surround every word he spoke. What very few people understood was that certainty came with a cost. 5 years before, one trusted executive had quietly leaked proprietary software to a competitor. The betrayal had erased nearly $100 million in projected revenue and forced Richard to spend months rebuilding the company's reputation. Ever since that day, suspicion had become part of his leadership. Every unfamiliar face represented a possible weakness. Every unexpected interruption felt like the beginning of another expensive lesson. The merger scheduled for this morning was supposed to erase years of uncertainty. Representatives from investors across New York, Chicago, Dallas, and Seattle were watching the presentation through secure video links. Lawyers had reviewed contracts for months. Analysts predicted the agreement would make Coleman Technologies one of the largest cybersecurity firms in the country. Failure was simply not an acceptable outcome. Richard looked again at Marcus Bennett. The maintenance jacket, the toolbox, the quiet confidence. None of it matched the polished image of the consultants and executives who usually entered this room. Richard noticed how several board members had already begun whispering among themselves. Some seemed uncomfortable. Others appeared impatient. Emily Brooks, the company's human resources director, shifted in her chair without speaking. Daniel Foster, the head of security, remained near the doorway, watching Marcus with professional focus instead of hostility. Something about the stranger's composure made Daniel hesitate. Most unauthorized visitors protested immediately or attempted to explain themselves. Marcus had done neither. He simply waited, almost as though he believed time itself would eventually prove him right. Richard disliked that feeling. It reminded him of moments when hidden information existed beyond his control. He turned toward Daniel. Did anyone authorize this visitor? Daniel answered honestly. Not through my department. Richard nodded once, expecting that response. Then he addressed the room. We cannot allow uncertainty to dictate this meeting. We move forward according to procedure. His voice remained calm, but the confidence sounded heavier now. Marcus quietly lifted his eyes toward the massive presentation screen where the merger documents still glowed beneath the company logo. Reflections from the morning sun shimmered across the glass wall behind it like ripples on still water. For the first time since entering the room, Marcus noticed a tiny green indicator blinking beside the secure network connection. It flashed once, paused, then flashed again. Almost no one else would have recognized its significance. Marcus did. The altered file had not finished, communicating with its hidden destination. Whatever had been placed inside the presentation was still active. He slowly looked back toward Richard Coleman and realized the greatest threat inside the boardroom was not the misunderstanding surrounding his identity. It was the fact that every passing second allowed someone else, somewhere beyond those walls, to move one step closer to succeeding. Marcus Bennett kept his eyes on the tiny green light blinking beside the secure network connection. Once. Pause. Once again. The rhythm confirmed what he had feared the moment he entered the executive floor. The modified presentation was still communicating with an outside source. Every second the board delayed increased the chance that confidential information could leave the building without anyone noticing. He slowly lifted the small security device in his hand. It was not a weapon. It was a portable network analyzer, the kind used by cybersecurity specialists to verify encrypted traffic inside protected facilities. Richard Coleman mistook the movement for defiance. That is enough, he said firmly. Daniel, remove him from this room. Daniel Foster took 2 careful steps forward, but something stopped him before he reached Marcus. Years of working corporate security had taught him to read body language. Marcus showed none of the signs normally associated with deception. His breathing remained steady. His shoulders stayed relaxed. His attention never wandered toward an exit. He looked like a man trying to protect something rather than escape with it. Marcus spoke before anyone touched him. Mr. Coleman, if I leave now, your presentation will continue exactly as planned. That is the problem. Richard folded his arms. Explain yourself. Marcus nodded once toward the giant display. The file on that screen is not the same file your legal department approved yesterday afternoon. A murmur swept around the table. Several executives glanced toward one another. Emily Brooks immediately opened her laptop and searched for the final document version listed in the meeting agenda. Richard remained unconvinced. You expect this board to believe you somehow know our internal files. Marcus answered without raising his voice. I expect this board to verify them. The room became still again. Marcus carefully placed his analyzer on the polished conference table. Its small display emitted a soft blue glow that reflected across the glossy wood. Thin lines of encrypted traffic scrolled silently across the screen. Your network is transmitting information through an unauthorized process, Marcus said. It began less than 3 minutes ago when this presentation was opened. Richard looked toward his chief technology officer. The executive frowned while rapidly typing commands into his laptop. His confident expression slowly disappeared. That should not be happening, he admitted quietly. Richard's attention snapped back to Marcus. How could you possibly know that? Marcus did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the side pocket of his toolbox and removed a sealed envelope bearing the embossed crest of Coleman Technologies' board of directors. The envelope had never been opened. He placed it gently beside the analyzer but did not touch it again. Everything you need to understand who I am is inside, he said calmly. But opening it will take less than 30 seconds. Stopping the data transfer takes less than 10. Richard stared at the envelope without moving. Around the room, the executives shifted uneasily. The chief technology officer suddenly looked up from his computer, his voice lower than before. Richard, the network traffic is real. I cannot identify where it is going. Sunlight stretched farther across the conference table as clouds drifted away outside, filling the silent room with warm morning light that sharply contrasted the growing tension inside. Marcus slowly turned the analyzer so everyone could see the blinking signal. It flashed once more before changing color from green to amber. Marcus exhaled softly. We just lost another opportunity to stop whoever is receiving your files before they know we have discovered them. The amber light on the analyzer blinked one final time before turning a steady red. No alarm sounded. No flashing warning appeared on the giant presentation screen. That was exactly what troubled Marcus Bennett the most. The most dangerous security failures rarely announce themselves. They hid behind ordinary moments, allowing everyone to believe everything was still under control. The chief technology officer swallowed hard as lines of code continued scrolling across his laptop. Richard, he said carefully, I have confirmed an unauthorized encrypted session. It is bypassing our normal monitoring tools. The words landed heavily across the boardroom. Several executives who had dismissed Marcus only moments earlier now stared at the display with growing concern. Richard Coleman refused to let uncertainty control the room. Disconnect the presentation from the network immediately, he ordered. The technology officer hesitated. If I terminated incorrectly, we could erase the evidence before discovering who initiated the transfer. Richard looked toward Marcus again. For the first time, frustration mixed with something less familiar. Doubt. Marcus noticed it, but did not take satisfaction in it. His attention remained fixed on the blinking logs flowing across the analyzer. There is still a way to preserve everything, he said quietly. But everyone has to stop touching the network. An uneasy silence followed. Fingers slowly lifted away from laptop keyboards. Tablet screens went dark one after another. Even the assistants seated along the side wall lowered their phones onto the polished table. Sunlight continued pouring through the glass windows, casting long reflections across chrome water pitchers and crystal glasses that now sat untouched. Daniel Foster finally spoke. If he is lying, we lose a few minutes. If he is telling the truth, we may save the company. Richard did not answer immediately. His eyes drifted toward the sealed envelope resting beside the analyzer. The embossed seal of the board of directors remained perfectly intact. Whoever had delivered it had expected it to be opened under very different circumstances. Emily Brooks leaned forward. Richard, the board scheduled a confidential executive session late yesterday afternoon after you left for your investor dinner. Richard slowly turned toward her. Why was I not informed? Emily looked genuinely uncomfortable. I assumed you already knew. Those 6 words changed the atmosphere inside the room. Several board members quietly exchanged uncertain glances. Richard suddenly realized there might be conversations that had occurred beyond his knowledge, something that had almost never happened during his years as chief executive officer. Before anyone could speak again, the chief technology officer's face lost its remaining color. He looked up from his screen, his voice barely louder than a whisper. Someone inside this building is remotely approving security credentials every 30 seconds. Those approvals are coming from an executive account. The room became perfectly still. No one moved. No one reached for a keyboard. Every executive instinctively looked around the table, wondering whether the person responsible might be sitting only a few feet away. Marcus slowly closed his eyes for a brief moment before opening them again. It was exactly the pattern he had expected to find. This was never an attack from outside the company. It required someone with legitimate authority. Richard followed Marcus's gaze across the conference table, noticing expressions he had never questioned before. Trusted colleagues suddenly looked unfamiliar beneath the bright morning light. Marcus finally spoke with the same calm voice he had carried since entering the room. The person stealing your information is depending on one thing above everything else. They are counting on all of you to keep looking at me instead of looking at each other. No one spoke after Marcus finished his sentence. The silence settled over the boardroom with surprising weight, soft enough to hear the faint vibration of the heating system behind the walls and the distant murmur of traffic 30 floors below. Morning sunlight continued drifting across the polished table until it reached the unopened envelope beside Marcus's analyzer. Dust particles floated through the narrow beams of light, rising and falling almost lazily, while every person in the room remained perfectly still. Richard Coleman slowly lowered his hands onto the back of his chair. For the first time in years, he realized he had spent the past several minutes defending assumptions instead of examining facts. He looked around the room, not as the founder of the company, but as someone searching for answers hidden in familiar faces. Some executives avoided eye contact. Others stared quietly at the glowing presentation screen, as though hoping someone else would speak first. Emily Brooks gently closed her laptop. The soft click echoed far louder than it should have inside the motionless room. Daniel Foster stepped away from the doorway without saying a word and positioned himself near the conference table, not to confront anyone, but simply to observe. Marcus appreciated the change. Observation always revealed more than accusation. He reached toward the analyzer and adjusted one setting with careful precision. The red indicator faded to blue as streams of encrypted activity expanded across the display in neat columns. Every movement of his hands reflected years of practiced patience. There was no urgency in his gestures because urgency often created mistakes. Richard watched him closely. This was not the behavior of someone improvising under pressure. It was the quiet rhythm of a professional following a process he trusted. Marcus finally looked up. "Whoever altered the presentation expected panic," he said calmly. "Panic causes people to overwrite evidence, disconnect systems, and erase the trail without realizing it." Nobody interrupted him. Even the chief technology officer had stopped typing. Instead, he quietly observed the analyzer with growing respect. Marcus continued. "Sometimes protecting the truth means waiting long enough for it to reveal itself." Richard glanced once more at the sealed envelope bearing the board of directors' seal. The temptation to open it grew stronger with every passing second, but something told him the envelope alone would not answer the most important question in the room. His attention shifted toward the giant display again. The merger presentation still appeared unchanged, complete with company branding, financial forecasts, and carefully prepared charts. Everything looked ordinary. Marcus noticed Richard studying the screen. "That is exactly why this attack was designed that way," he explained softly. "The safest place to hide a lie is inside something everyone already believes." The words lingered in the air. Several executives quietly reflected on how quickly they had accepted the first explanation offered that morning. Outside, a cloud drifted across the sun, dimming the room for only a few seconds before brilliant light returned through the glass. The changing brightness reflected across the conference table like a slow tide, illuminating every face equally. Marcus drew one steady breath before touching a final command on the analyzer. A new identification number appeared across the display. The chief technology officer leaned closer, his eyes widening as recognition replaced confusion. He looked toward Richard with an expression that carried no uncertainty at all. "I know that authorization key," he whispered. "It belongs to someone sitting at this table." The chief technology officer stared at the authorization key for several long seconds before slowly turning his laptop so the entire board could see the identifier reflected across the screen. "This credential belongs to Vice President Alan Mercer," he said quietly. The words seemed to absorb every remaining sound inside the conference room. Alan Mercer, who had spent 12 years helping build Coleman Technologies into one of the most respected cybersecurity firms in the country, remained seated near the middle of the table. His tailored charcoal suit looked as immaculate as it had an hour earlier, yet the confidence that usually defined him had quietly disappeared. Richard Coleman looked toward the executive he had trusted through acquisitions, product launches, and difficult negotiations. "Alan," he said carefully, "tell me this is some kind of mistake." Alan managed a strained smile. "Authorization keys can be copied. Anyone with enough skill could imitate them." Marcus Bennett listened without interrupting. He had heard similar explanations before. The details changed. The pattern never did. Calmly, he reached into his toolbox and removed a small encrypted storage drive sealed inside a transparent evidence pouch. He placed it beside the unopened envelope. "The authorization key was only the beginning," Marcus said. "This device recorded every verification request made inside the executive network after 6 o'clock this morning. The sequence cannot be edited without breaking the digital signature." The chief technology officer accepted the drive with careful hands and connected it to an isolated forensic workstation that had been sitting and used beside the presentation console. Within seconds, a chronological log appeared across the monitor. Every approval request matched Alan Mercer's executive credentials. More importantly, each request had originated from the laptop resting directly in front of him. Alan leaned forward as though preparing another explanation, but stopped when the final entry appeared on the screen. It included a precise timestamp from less than 5 minutes earlier, recorded while everyone in the room had been watching Marcus instead of the network. Richard slowly lowered himself into his chair. He felt neither anger nor triumph, only disappointment. He remembered recommending Alan for promotions, celebrating his daughter's college graduation, and trusting him with decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The realization settled heavily across his shoulders. Emily Brooks quietly reached for the sealed envelope at last. She looked toward Richard for permission. He nodded. Breaking the seal, she unfolded a single letter printed on board of director's stationery. Her voice remained steady as she read aloud. Effective immediately, Mr. Marcus Bennett has been retained by unanimous vote of the board as an independent security auditor with full authority to conduct an unannounced integrity assessment of executive operations. The chief executive officer was intentionally excluded from prior notification to ensure the evaluation remained unbiased. No one spoke after she finished. Richard slowly looked toward Marcus. The maintenance jacket, the worn toolbox, the quiet patience. Every detail suddenly carried an entirely different meaning. Marcus had never entered the building pretending to be someone else. He had simply allowed people to decide who he was before asking. Sunlight filled the boardroom once more, washing across the polished table where the unopened assumptions of the morning had finally given way to undeniable truth. And in that long silence, Richard understood that the greatest security weakness uncovered that day had never been hidden inside the company's network. It had been hidden inside the judgments people made before they knew the person standing in front of them. No one rushed toward Alan Mercer. No accusations filled the room. The evidence had already spoken more clearly than raised voices ever could. Daniel Foster quietly stepped beside the vice president and, with calm professionalism, asked him to leave his company laptop exactly where it was until the internal investigation team arrived. Alan looked around the boardroom, searching the faces of colleagues who had trusted him for years. He opened his mouth as though preparing one final explanation, but the words never came. Slowly, he leaned back into his chair and lowered his eyes to the polished table. Richard Coleman remained standing near the head of the room. The confidence that had always defined his posture had given way to reflection. His gaze drifted toward Marcus Bennett, then toward the maintenance jacket that only minutes earlier had shaped his first impression. He replayed the morning in his mind. He remembered pointing across the room before asking a single question. He remembered assuming the toolbox represented danger instead of responsibility. He remembered allowing appearance to outweigh evidence. The realization settled heavily inside him. Richard walked around the conference table at an unhurried pace until he stopped a few feet from Marcus. The morning sunlight illuminated both men equally through the tall windows, softening the sharp shadows that had divided the room earlier. Richard extended his hand, then hesitated for a brief moment. "Mr. Bennett," he said quietly, "before anything else happens today, I owe you an apology. I judged you before I knew you. I allowed fear to speak before facts did. That should never happen inside a company built on trust." The room remained silent. Every executive watched Marcus, wondering whether he would respond with anger, satisfaction, or quiet revenge. Instead, Marcus smiled gently. It was not the smile of someone who had won. It was the expression of someone relieved that the truth no longer needed defending. He accepted Richard's handshake without hesitation. "Thank you," Marcus replied. "Apologies matter because they create room for something better. But what matters even more is what happens after the apology." Richard nodded slowly. Marcus continued, his voice steady and warm. "Security is not only about protecting servers, files, and buildings. It is also about protecting fairness. The moment people stop asking questions because they believe they already know the answer, every system becomes vulnerable." Emily Brooks quietly looked around the table. Several executives lowered their eyes, recognizing pieces of themselves in Marcus's words. The chief technology officer closed his laptop with a thoughtful expression. Daniel Foster allowed himself the smallest smile of respect. Richard turned toward the rest of the board. "Effective immediately," he said. "Our executive leadership training will include decision-making, bias awareness, and investigative discipline. We cannot claim to protect information if we fail to protect integrity." Marcus gathered his analyzer, carefully placed it inside the toolbox, and secured the metal latches with the same quiet precision that had marked every movement throughout the morning. Before leaving, he paused beside the conference table one final time. "People rarely reveal their character during easy moments," he said softly. They reveal it during their first judgment of someone they do not know. No one answered because there was nothing left to argue. The lesson had already reached every corner of the room, leaving behind something far more valuable than a successful investigation. It left behind a different way of seeing the person standing quietly in front of you. By late afternoon, the executive floor no longer sounded the way it had that morning. The hurried footsteps had faded. Conference room doors closed softly instead of slamming with urgency. Outside the towering windows, the Charlotte skyline shimmered beneath the warm glow of the setting sun, each pane of glass reflecting a quieter ending than anyone had imagined only hours before. The investigation team carefully documented every piece of digital evidence, while the board of directors postponed the merger until every security question had been answered. Employees moved through the hallways with lowered voices, not because they had been instructed to, but because everyone understood they had witnessed something that reached far beyond a cybersecurity audit. Richard Coleman stood alone inside the now-empty boardroom. The polished conference table reflected the fading light where Marcus Bennett's toolbox had rested earlier that day. Richard traced his hand lightly across the smooth wood, remembering how quickly certainty had replaced curiosity. The memory humbled him more than any financial loss ever could. On the table rested a single handwritten note he had prepared after the meeting. It was addressed to every employee in the company. It did not mention profits, market share, or technology. Instead, it contained one promise. Coleman Technologies would become a place where evidence mattered more than assumptions and where respect would never depend upon appearance, clothing, job title, or first impressions. Across the lobby downstairs, Marcus quietly signed the visitor log before preparing to leave. The security officer who had nearly escorted him out that morning now opened the front door with genuine respect. "Thank you for what you did today, sir," he said. Marcus smiled warmly. "You were doing your job. We all were. The important part is that we kept looking for the truth." The guard nodded thoughtfully as Marcus stepped outside into the gentle evening air. A cool breeze moved through the trees lining the sidewalk, carrying the familiar sounds of the city beginning its evening routine. Marcus placed the toolbox in the back of his pickup truck, paused for a moment, and looked back at the glass tower standing against the orange sky. It looked exactly the same as it had that morning, yet everything inside had changed. His phone vibrated softly with a new message from the board of directors thanking him for his professionalism and confirming the successful completion of the audit. Marcus read it once, smiled quietly, and slipped the phone back into his pocket. He did not measure success by recognition. He measured it by knowing that honest work had made tomorrow a little better than yesterday. High above, Richard watched from the boardroom window as Marcus's truck slowly disappeared into the evening traffic. He realized he would probably never forget the image of a man in a simple maintenance jacket carrying a worn toolbox into a room full of executives who believed they could identify someone's worth with a single glance. They had all been wrong. The last rays of sunlight stretched across the empty conference table before fading into the quiet room. No applause remained. No arguments lingered. Only stillness. And in that silence lived a lesson none of them would ever need written into a company handbook again. Respect is never earned by the clothes someone wears or the title beside their name. It begins the moment we choose to see the person before making the judgment.